The military drone sat in the scrapyard, scorched black, its frame twisted, worth nothing more than a few thousand scrap dollars to anyone watching. But when ambitious CEO Evelyn Langford bought it to showcase her bold vision for defense technology, single father Mason Reed went still. Beneath the burned plating carved by hand was a name no factory stamp could explain: Grace. It was not a serial code. It was the final signal left by a friend who died on a mission Mason had been forced to bury in silence for 7 long, haunting years, a silence about to break. The auction floor stretched across an old hangar outside Reno, where rows of decommissioned military hardware sat under cold fluorescent light, waiting for buyers who saw scrap where soldiers had once seen survival. Private defense contractors filled the aisles that morning, each hunting for forgotten technology they could repurpose, rebrand, or quietly strip for parts. Evelyn Langford arrived with the kind of presence that made conversations pause, trailed by a small army of lawyers and engineers from Langford Aerotech, her tailored coat a sharp contrast against the dust and rust around her. Her company was bleeding. A major defense contract had collapsed months earlier, taking with it the confidence of investors who once treated the Langford name as untouchable, and Evelyn had come searching for something bold enough to reverse the narrative before the board lost patience entirely. Near the center of the floor sat a drone unlike anything else on display, its body scorched black and folded inward as though it had survived an explosion rather than simple wear. Engineers walked past it without a second glance, murmuring that the housing alone wasn't worth the shipping cost, let alone the components buried somewhere inside its ruined frame. Carter Voss, Langford's chief operating officer, saw something else entirely. He leaned toward Evelyn with the practiced charm of a man who had built his career on packaging weakness as opportunity, suggesting that buying the wreck and parading it as a symbol of fearless innovation would generate exactly the kind of headline the company needed. A CEO bold enough to resurrect the unwanted, he said, was a story the press would not be able to resist. Mason Reed stood several rows away, dressed in a faded work jacket with grease still drying on his knuckles, there only because a supplier had tipped him off about a pallet of cheap circuit boards worth scavenging for his freelance repair business. He kept to himself the way he always did at events like this, watching the wealthier buyers move through the aisles like they owned the air around them. He barely noticed the burned drone until a forklift operator shifted its frame to load it onto a flatbed, rotating the hull just enough to expose a section near the core compartment that most people would have dismissed as another scorch mark. Mason's stomach tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. The pattern of damage near that compartment wasn't random, and the seam beneath it carried a manual marking he recognized instantly, the kind etched by hand rather than stamped by any factory machine he had ever worked with. He forced his expression still, the old discipline returning before he even decided to use it, while across the floor Evelyn placed a bid on the drone that made several onlookers actually applaud, certain they were witnessing nothing more than clever theater. When the gavel fell and the sale was confirmed, Evelyn turned briefly toward the crowd, satisfied with the calculated risk she believed she had just taken. Her eyes caught Mason's instead, lingering on the unreadable focus on his face as he stared at the drone being secured for transport. She asked, almost offhand, whether he knew anything about military hardware. Before Mason could answer, Carter stepped between them with a dismissive laugh, explaining that the man was simply a freelance repair technician, not worth the CEO's time. Mason said nothing in his own defense. He only offered a quiet observation that some things called scrap weren't worthless at all, only inconvenient to certain people who preferred them buried. The remark landed harder than he intended, and he saw something shift behind Evelyn's composed expression, a flicker of curiosity she didn't get the chance to chase, because Carter was already guiding her toward the next aisle with practiced urgency. Mason watched the flatbed roll the drone toward a waiting Langford transport truck, his jaw tight, his mind already pulled 7 years into the past toward a memory he had spent every day since trying not to revisit. Mason Reed lived a quiet life on the edge of a small suburb, the kind of street where neighbors recognized his truck more than his face, since he rarely lingered outside long enough for conversation. He made his living repairing electronics that other people had given up on, generators, control panels, old guidance systems that wealthier clients no longer wanted to throw away. He was good at it in a way that went far beyond ordinary skill, particularly when it came to circuitry tied to flight control and sensor arrays, though almost no one in town knew why a small-town repairman understood drone hardware as fluently as he understood his own hands. His past belonged to a classified military drone program that had been sealed away after an incident the official record described only in the coldest possible language. Years earlier, Mason had worked alongside Logan Pierce, a field engineer with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of right and wrong, the kind of friend who felt more like family than colleague. On their final mission together, a prototype reconnaissance drone lost control mid-flight, and Logan did not survive the resulting crash. Mason was pulled from the wreckage with injuries that healed far faster than the guilt that followed, and within days he was handed paperwork attributing the failure to a maintenance error, paperwork he was pressured into signing under threat of prosecution for mishandling defense secrets. He left that world entirely after that, choosing a smaller life on purpose, one where nothing he touched could explode in someone else's hands. His daughter was the quiet center of that choice, though he rarely spoke of her, content to let her remain a private reason rather than a public detail in a life he had deliberately made unremarkable. In a metal box he kept locked in his closet, he still held a handful of scorched components, a few old photographs of his technical unit, and a single scrap of paper bearing 2 words that meant nothing to anyone else: Grace Protocol. Grace was not simply a name. It was the designation Logan had given to a final safeguard system he designed himself, a layer of protection meant to prevent any drone from being hijacked mid-mission no matter who tried to seize control of it. Mason had always believed that particular drone, the one carrying Logan's last work, had been destroyed completely by the military years ago, dismantled and erased the way classified failures usually were. Seeing it resurface at a public auction made no sense, and the longer he sat with that fact that night, the more it gnawed at something he had buried on purpose. Sleep didn't come easily. He kept replaying the last transmission he'd ever heard from Logan, a fractured radio message sent moments before the crash, warning that if anyone ever found the name burned inside the wreckage, the truth would still be alive even if he wasn't. Mason understood now, with a clarity that frightened him, that the drone Evelyn Langford had purchased wasn't ordinary scrap at all. It was the only surviving piece of evidence that the accident which took Logan's life had never been an accident in the first place. Returning to that world risked everything he had quietly rebuilt, the calm, anonymous existence that let him raise his daughter without the shadow of men in suits deciding what truths were inconvenient. But before he could settle on an answer either way, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number tied to Langford Aerotech, a request that Evelyn herself wanted him brought in to examine the drone he'd recognized from across a crowded auction floor. Langford Aerotech's main floor had been cleared for the occasion, the burned drone positioned at its center beneath bright overhead lights like a sculpture meant to announce a company's resurrection. Evelyn stood beside it in front of her assembled staff, declaring that the wreck everyone else had written off would become the foundation for an entirely new generation of rescue drones, technology built not for conquest but for saving lives. Her ambition reached further than profit margins. She wanted to restore the legacy her father had built before the company began bleeding contracts and credibility, and this project, however unconventional, felt like her only real chance to do it. Not everyone shared her conviction. Senior leadership exchanged skeptical glances throughout the announcement, unconvinced that a piece of scorched hardware could justify the resources Evelyn intended to pour into it. Carter Voss played the loyal supporter in public, nodding along with practiced enthusiasm, while privately working to control every stage of the restoration process so that nothing about the drone's true history could surface without passing through him first. When Mason walked onto the factory floor that morning, the engineers eyed him the way they might eye an intruder who had wandered in from the parking lot, unimpressed by his worn jacket and the simple tool bag slung over one shoulder. Carter wasted no time establishing the hierarchy, asking in front of the gathered staff whether Mason had ever repaired anything more sophisticated than a household appliance. Mason absorbed the insult without flinching, offering no retort, his calm unsettling in its own quiet way. Evelyn studied that silence carefully, caught somewhere between suspicion and genuine curiosity about the man Carter seemed so eager to diminish. When the engineering team powered up the drone's diagnostic systems for the first time, every panel returned nothing but error codes, and the consensus quickly formed that the control core was beyond recovery. Mason stepped closer to the hull and asked, firmly, for an emergency shutdown of the power feed. Carter mocked the request, suggesting Mason simply didn't understand military-grade equipment well enough to know it posed no danger. Moments later, the control panel began emitting an unfamiliar pulsing signal, and the dismissive laughter in the room died fast. Mason pointed to a scorched conduit running along the frame, explaining that continued power would trigger a dormant thermal memory buried inside the casing, something none of the standard diagnostic protocols were designed to detect. Evelyn ordered an immediate halt before anyone could question her judgment a second time. Mason crouched beside the open compartment, examining the blackened interior more closely than he had allowed himself at the auction, and there it was again, the hand-carved lettering pressed into the metal, Grace. For a moment he forgot where he was. Evelyn noticed the shift in his expression and asked directly what the name meant, watching him closely as though she already sensed the answer mattered more than he was willing to admit. Mason offered a careful lie instead of the truth, suggesting it might be nothing more than an old marking left behind by the original production crew. Evelyn accepted the explanation outwardly, though her instincts told her otherwise. Behind them, unnoticed by most of the room, Carter's composed expression had gone visibly pale, his eyes fixed on the burned letters, as though he were staring at something he had spent years convinced no one would ever see again. Mason began a full inspection of the drone under the watchful eyes of Evelyn, Carter, and the rest of the engineering team, cross-referencing what he found against the paperwork filed at the auction. Almost immediately, details refused to line up. The drone had been listed as a training unit destroyed by a battery malfunction, but the internal framework told an entirely different story, one belonging to a unit equipped with genuine military-grade navigation systems rather than anything used for routine drills. Several circuit boards had clearly been removed before the sale, stripped deliberately, yet the memory core itself remained sealed beneath a heat-resistant casing reserved for situations where data needed to survive catastrophic impact. Mason recognized that kind of sealing immediately. It wasn't standard procedure for scrapped equipment. It was the kind of protective measure used only when someone wanted to guarantee that critical information would still exist after everything around it had burned. Carter pushed repeatedly for permission to crack the core open and harvest the material for research purposes, his urgency far sharper than the situation seemed to warrant. Mason objected, warning that an improper extraction would destroy whatever final data remained inside permanently. Evelyn began noticing how hard Carter was pressing the issue, a persistence that felt less like enthusiasm and more like desperation. Quietly, Mason asked to see the original sale documentation, and Evelyn handed him a copy that included an old approval signature buried near the bottom of the page. He recognized the signature instantly. It belonged to an intermediary company connected, years earlier, to the very accident that had killed Logan. He said nothing to Evelyn yet, uncertain whether he could trust her fully with information that dangerous, not until he understood exactly where her loyalties would eventually land. That night, Carter slipped back into the factory alone, attempting to pry open the drone's inner compartment before anyone else could examine it further. Mason, suspicious enough to return after hours himself, caught him in the act, hands already working at the casing around the core. Carter abandoned any pretense of civility, warning Mason that certain small people needed to understand their limits before they got hurt by overstepping them. Mason answered evenly that the dead had limits too, right up until someone decided to burn the evidence that proved how they died. Carter threatened to terminate Mason's contract on the spot and paint him publicly as an unstable man obsessed with a past nobody else cared about. Evelyn arrived moments later, alerted by a security notification, and Carter immediately reversed his tone, accusing Mason of trespassing on restricted company property. Evelyn found herself caught between two conflicting stories, unsure which man deserved her trust. Mason gestured toward a small auxiliary camera mounted on the drone's housing, pointing out that if it still functioned, it would settle definitively who had actually touched the core first. Evelyn ordered the entire restricted area sealed off for the night and instructed that Mason remain on staff as lead technical consultant, a decision that left Carter's expression unreadable as he walked away. Reluctantly, Mason told Evelyn a piece of the truth he had buried for years. 7 years earlier, he had been part of a technical support team for a classified reconnaissance drone program, one built around aircraft capable of automatically returning to base if it ever lost communication mid-flight. Logan Pierce had designed the heart of that safeguard himself, a hidden security layer he called the Grace Protocol, meant to prevent any outside party from seizing control of the aircraft against its operator's will. Logan chose the name deliberately as a quiet reminder that even the most advanced military technology still needed a moral boundary built into its core. During their final mission, the drone was redirected without authorization. Logan discovered a backdoor someone had quietly installed into its control system, And before he could report the breach through proper channels, the mission ended in an explosion that killed him instantly and left Mason badly injured. In the aftermath, blame was assigned swiftly and conveniently to maintenance failure, and Mason was pressured into signing a confidentiality agreement under the explicit threat of prosecution for endangering classified defense operations if he ever spoke otherwise. Evelyn listened carefully, though she kept a measure of caution in her expression, and asked why Mason had never reported what he believed had actually happened. He explained that he had tried more than once, only to watch records disappear and witnesses get quietly reassigned to postings far from anyone who might ask questions. By the time he gave up, he was a single father with no institutional power left to challenge men who wore expensive suits and made inconvenient truths vanish without effort. Something in Evelyn's expression shifted as she absorbed his account. She admitted, in turn, that her own father had lost a major contract years earlier after refusing to sell proprietary flight software to a suspicious group of intermediaries, a decision that had quietly cost Langford Aerotech client after client in the years that followed. Mason suspected immediately that the two stories were connected, though neither of them had enough proof yet to say so with confidence. Evelyn asked for his help recovering whatever remained inside the drone's damaged memory core. Mason warned her plainly that if his suspicions were correct, the person responsible wasn't only Carter Voss. It could be part of a wider network that had spent years profiting from defense technology, wartime contracts, and accidents quietly engineered to look accidental. Evelyn chose to continue anyway, recognizing for the first time a chance not only to save her company but to clear her father's name from a stain she had never understood until that moment. What had started as mutual suspicion between them began shifting toward something closer to a cautious alliance. That evening, Mason opened his old toolbox at home and removed a small encryption key Logan had given him years earlier, an object he had kept hidden and untouched through 7 years of silence, never quite able to bring himself to use it until now. Mason, a small team of trusted engineers, to begin restoring the drone's core inside a sealed laboratory, deliberately keeping the work away from Carter's reach. Evelyn personally oversaw every step, refusing him access despite his repeated requests to be included. Outside the lab, Carter remained outwardly calm but quietly placed a call to an unfamiliar contact, murmuring that Grace was still alive after all these years. Mason discovered the core hadn't been destroyed completely. It had simply locked itself the moment it detected unauthorized tampering, a defensive measure built directly into its design. Using the encryption key Logan had left behind, he managed to break through the first protective layer. The screen flickered to life with fragmented data, mission maps, flight coordinates, and the final control log recorded before the crash. The records showed clearly that the drone hadn't gone down because of any technical failure at all. It had received a falsified command from an internal source, one that wasn't designed to destroy the aircraft but to redirect sensitive data straight into the hands of a third party. Worse still, Logan had triggered the Grace protocol himself, forcing the drone to self-destruct rather than let it complete that unauthorized transfer. Mason realized, with a wave of grief he hadn't expected, that Logan's death had never been the result of his own mistake. It had happened because he stopped a betrayal in progress. He fought to stay composed as Evelyn discovered something else buried in the recovered log, the name of a shell company that had once held a quiet consulting contract with Langford Aerotech, a company now directly tied to Carter Voss. Evelyn's anger flared immediately, but Mason urged caution, reminding her that suspicion alone wouldn't be enough. They needed the complete data set, not fragments. At that exact moment, the factory's internal network came under sudden attack, and the recovered files began deleting themselves remotely before their eyes. Mason reacted instantly, severing the physical connection, pulling backup power, and shifting the core into full isolation before more damage could spread. Evelyn watched him work with a kind of focused precision she hadn't witnessed from anyone on her actual engineering staff, and understood in that instant that he wasn't simply a repairman who happened to know drones. He understood this entire system on a level few people alive still did. They managed to save a portion of the data, though the most critical section remained encrypted and out of reach. Just before the screen went dark, one final line of text appeared across it. Authorized override, Voss. Evelyn turned slowly toward the nearest security monitor, her expression hardening into something cold and unmistakable as she processed exactly what that meant. By morning, Carter Voss was nowhere to be found on the factory floor. The laboratory fell quiet in the minutes after the attack, the hum of cooling fans the only sound left in a room that had nearly lost everything. Evelyn sat down heavily in one of the chairs, staring at the dark monitors as though they might still hold an answer if she watched long enough. Mason gathered the salvage drives carefully, labeling each one by hand, refusing to trust the recovery to anything connected to the wider network again. He understood now that whoever had tried to wipe the data wasn't guessing at its location. They had known exactly where to strike and exactly when. Evelyn finally broke the silence, asking quietly whether Mason had expected something like this from the very beginning. He admitted he had feared it, though hope had kept him from saying so out loud. 7 years of silence had taught him that people willing to falsify a mission report were rarely careless enough to leave loose ends unguarded for long. The two of them sat together in the dim laboratory long after the rest of the staff had gone home, neither willing to leave the recovered fragments unattended until a more secure location could be arranged for the night. By the following morning, news outlets were already reporting that Langford Aerotech had allowed an unstable former military contractor unsupervised access to sensitive defense hardware. Mason's name leaked within hours, his old accident twisted into something unrecognizable, framed as proof of instability rather than tragedy. Carter appeared before the board of directors that same day, accusing Mason of manipulating Evelyn in order to steal proprietary technology for his own gain. Panic spread quickly among the executives, all of them terrified that any connection to sealed military data could trigger a federal investigation capable of destroying the company outright. Evelyn was pressured into suspending the entire drone project and dismissing Mason immediately. He took the news without surprise, having been discarded this exact way once before by people who valued convenience over truth. Evelyn stood caught between two impossible choices: protecting her company by sacrificing a man she barely knew, or trusting him against the wishes of everyone around her. Carter presented manufactured evidence to support his case, a security clip showing Mason entering the factory late at night, carefully edited to remove the footage of Carter prying open the core himself just minutes earlier. Security escorted Mason out of the building in full view of the staff, the moment carrying all the weight of a public humiliation. Several engineers who had mocked him weeks earlier now stood in uncomfortable silence, fully aware that this was the same man who had saved their recovered data only days before. Evelyn couldn't openly defy the board without stronger proof in hand, and Mason understood that constraint without resentment. Before leaving, he told her quietly that if she wanted the truth, she needed to search her father's old contract archive instead of the current data room Carter controlled so tightly. Carter overheard enough of that exchange to immediately order the archive locked down. Mason left the building, but not before slipping Evelyn a small note containing a string of code Logan had once used for secure communications. Evelyn began investigating on her own that same night, uncovering several old Langford contracts that had clearly been altered after her father's death. Carter's name appeared repeatedly as a secondary approver, despite holding no official position at the company during that earlier period. Evelyn realized with growing unease that Carter had been embedded in the company's shadows far longer than she had ever imagined. Mason returned home to find his garage ransacked, the small metal box containing Logan's old photographs and fragments of evidence gone entirely from the shelf where he had kept it locked away for 7 years. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the overturned drawers and the scattered tools, feeling an old familiar dread settle back into his chest. This wasn't a random burglary. Whoever had come through his garage had known precisely what they were looking for and exactly where to find it, which meant someone had been watching him far longer than he realized. He checked the small bedroom down the hall out of instinct, relieved to find it untouched, a small mercy in an otherwise unsettling night. Mason sat at his kitchen table afterward, staring at the empty space on the shelf where the metal box had sat for years, and forced himself to think clearly instead of giving in to panic. Whatever Carter wanted from that box, he hadn't gotten everything. The encryption key and the scrap of paper carrying Logan's final sequence were still safe, tucked away in a place no one but Mason himself would ever think to check. He resolved that night not to retreat, not after coming this close to the truth, and began quietly preparing for whatever Carter intended to do next. Mason understood quickly that whoever had broken into his garage wanted far more than data about the drone. They wanted everything Logan had ever left behind. A muddy boot print near the doorway matched a style of protective footwear used inside Langford's own storage facility, a detail that confirmed his growing suspicion about who had really been there. Meanwhile, Evelyn descended into the lowest archive level of the company, searching through records her father had filed away decades earlier. She found an internal report he had written, warning about a covert program quietly selling military drone technology through an intermediary firm, a report that had never reached anyone outside the building because it had been deliberately intercepted. The man who blocked it was Carter Voss, working at the time as a strategic advisor for one of Langford's defense partners. Evelyn finally understood that her father hadn't lost his major contracts through weakness or outdated thinking. He had been isolated and pushed aside because he tried to stop a betrayal already underway. The realization hit harder than she expected, years of quietly resenting her father's caution suddenly collapsing into grief and guilt she hadn't been prepared to feel. Carter found her there himself, no longer bothering to disguise his intentions. He told her almost casually that her father once had a chance to join something far larger than ethics could justify refusing, and chose principle over power instead. Evelyn found herself trapped as Carter locked the archive door and seized the hard drive containing her father's files. Mason arrived in time, having traced a signal from the encrypted code he'd given her earlier, and without resorting to any dramatic confrontation, used his understanding of the factory's internal systems to unlock a side entrance and pull Evelyn safely out of the room. Carter fled the scene but in his haste dropped an old access device. Mason examined it and discovered it carried clearance levels higher than even the CEO's own credentials, undeniable proof that a hidden tier of control had existed inside Langford Aerotech for years without Evelyn's knowledge. She realized then that her own company had been compromised from somewhere deep inside its own walls for far longer than she ever suspected. Mason explained that the Grace Protocol might not exist only inside the drone itself. Logan may have backed it up somewhere within an old Langford testing contract from years before. If they could locate that backup, they would finally have proof strong enough to expose everything. Evelyn decided to organize a public restoration demonstration before the board and a government oversight representative, pretending the goal was simply to salvage the failing project. In truth, she and Mason intended to use that exact stage to force Carter into the open. Mason offered one final thought before they parted for the night, that a traitor always returns to the place where he believes he erased every trace of himself. Evelyn informed the board that Langford Aerotech would conduct one final diagnostic test on the salvaged drone, inviting legal counsel, a defense contract oversight official, and every member of executive leadership to witness the results in person. Carter, believing Evelyn was simply making a desperate attempt to save face, returned to the building determined to control the demonstration from the inside. Mason reappeared as well, reinstated by Evelyn as an independent technical consultant despite Carter's furious objections that he posed an unacceptable security risk. Evelyn calmly insisted that everything be recorded in full view of the room. The drone sat at the center of the hangar, still scorched and misshapen, though Mason had rebuilt a temporary connection inside the damaged core over the previous days. The engineering staff split quietly into two camps, some trusting Mason's judgment, others still wary of crossing Carter openly. Mason began activating each restoration layer one at a time, and the overhead screen filled with fragments of old mission data heavily corrupted but unmistakably real. Carter, working unnoticed through his hidden access device, attempted to push one final deletion command into the system. Mason had already anticipated exactly that move. He allowed Carter to believe the command had succeeded while quietly redirecting it into a trap built directly into the Grace Protocol's architecture. The moment Carter entered his highest-level clearance code, the system silently recorded his true identity behind that intrusion. Seconds later, the large screen above them displayed a complete history of unauthorized access, confirming that Carter Voss had issued the falsified command that doomed the mission 7 years earlier. The hangar fell into stunned silence. Carter tried denying it outright, insisting the data had been fabricated by Mason to frame him. Mason triggered the second recovered layer, a final audio recording of Logan Pierce's voice, calmly explaining that someone within the chain of command had sold control of the drone to an outside party, and that he was activating Grace specifically to prevent it from reaching the wrong hands. Evelyn looked directly at Carter, finally understanding the full scope of what he had done, destroying her father's reputation, killing Logan, and burying Mason beneath 7 years of false blame. Carter's composure shattered completely. He lunged for the access terminal, attempting to physically destroy the drone's core before security could reach him. Mason intervened quickly and without unnecessary force, allowing the guards to restrain him without further incident. But an instant later, the drone's systems unexpectedly reactivated on their own. Carter laughed, half unhinged, declaring that Grace was no longer a safeguard at all, that he had turned it into a self-destruct switch instead. The unit began overheating rapidly, its auxiliary battery surging toward failure, raising the very real threat of fire spreading through the entire hangar. Panic rippled through the crowd as alarms began blaring. Mason understood immediately that disarming it would require reaching into the inner core by hand, into a section where the temperature was already climbing toward dangerous levels. Evelyn ordered an evacuation, but Mason refused, warning that if the drone exploded, the truth contained inside it would be lost along with everything else. With red emergency lights flashing across the hangar and the warning siren rising around him, Mason stepped toward the shuddering wreckage one final time. Mason pulled on a makeshift protective suit, knowing there was barely enough time left to matter. He climbed into the technical compartment beneath the drone's body, the same section that had been scorched in the original accident years earlier. Alarms continued screaming through the hangar as the remaining staff were pushed back behind a safety line. Evelyn refused to retreat completely, staying just beyond the barrier, her voice steady through the radio link connecting her to Mason inside the failing machine. Mason quickly realized that Carter had embedded a self-destruct command directly into the auxiliary power line. Disarming it required, following the exact logic Logan had built into the original Grace protocol, but a critical piece of that final sequence seemed to be missing entirely. Mason remembered something Logan had told him once, long before any of this happened, that Grace was never meant to function as a simple lock. It was a reminder to choose the right person before trusting them with that kind of power. He understood then that the name wasn't only a system label. It was a personal cipher, one that could only be unlocked by someone who had once held the original key without ever trying to seize control for himself. Mason entered the sequence preserved on Logan's old scrap of paper. The system requested manual confirmation through a hidden command etched somewhere on the drone's frame. Looking again at the burned letters spelling Grace, he noticed the characters weren't perfectly aligned, and realized each letter corresponded to a specific hidden mechanical switch concealed beneath the outer plating. He activated them one after another in careful order while the temperature inside the compartment continued climbing. Evelyn's voice cracked over the radio, urging him to get out if he couldn't finish in time. Mason told her plainly that he had spent 7 years running from the truth, and he wasn't going to run from it again. He triggered the final switch only seconds before the auxiliary battery would have failed completely. The drone went silent. After a long, breathless pause, the core restarted itself in a stable, secured mode, and the recovered data finally displayed in full across the overhead screen, the falsified commands, Carter's digital signature, and the original report Evelyn's father had tried desperately to send years earlier. Logan Pierce was cleared of every accusation that had followed his death. Mason's name was cleared as well. The oversight official ordered the entire dataset sealed for a formal federal investigation. Carter was led away in restraints, still insisting weakly that everything he had done was necessary to keep the company alive. Evelyn answered without hesitation that a company saved through betrayal was never worth saving in the first place. Mason climbed out of the compartment with a mild burn across one hand, his face exhausted but calm in a way it hadn't been in years. Evelyn looked at him differently now, no longer as a contractor she had hired on a whim, but as the man who had rescued her father's legacy and restored the honor of someone who had died trying to do the right thing. Before leaving the hangar, Mason rested his hand briefly against the scorched hull and said quietly, almost to himself, that it was finally over. Weeks later, the investigation widened far beyond anything the board had initially feared. Carter Voss and the shell network tied to him were fully exposed, their years of quiet manipulation laid out in documents that no longer carried any ambiguity. Langford Aerotech lost a number of short-term contracts in the immediate fallout, but slowly regained something more valuable than revenue, genuine public trust, earned the moment Evelyn chose to disclose the company's failures openly rather than bury them the way Carter once had. At a press conference held outside the same hangar where everything had unraveled, Evelyn refused to take personal credit for uncovering the truth. She told the assembled reporters plainly that the truth had been found by a man the system had once cast aside completely. Mason was offered a prominent position back in the defense technology field, with a substantial salary and the kind of professional reputation he had lost 7 years earlier. He hesitated before accepting anything. The industry that had taken his closest friend and nearly destroyed his own life still carried weight he wasn't sure he wanted to carry again. Evelyn didn't pressure him. Instead, she proposed something different entirely, a new civilian rescue drone division built specifically to repurpose old technology for search and recovery missions, wildfire response, flood relief, and emergency aid in places too remote for traditional rescue teams to reach quickly. The idea moved Mason in a way he hadn't expected, the thought of transforming a machine once weaponized into something built purely to save lives instead. He agreed to join, on the condition that every system going forward include an independent ethical safeguard, ensuring no single person could ever hold unchecked control over it again. Evelyn accepted without hesitation, and the new initiative was given a name that needed no explanation to anyone who had lived through the previous months: the Grace Initiative. Mason visited Logan's grave not long after, placing a cleaned fragment of the old drone's casing beside the headstone. He told his friend quietly that he hadn't died because of failure, but because he had stopped a betrayal before it could finish unfolding. Evelyn stood a respectful distance away, allowing him that private moment without intruding. The cemetery was quiet that afternoon, the kind of stillness that made 7 years feel both impossibly long and strangely brief at once. Mason knelt beside the headstone and brushed a few fallen leaves away from its base, his fingers lingering on the carved letters of his friend's name. He spoke softly, telling Logan about the new division, about the rescue drones, about a company finally willing to build something honest instead of profitable. He admitted, too, that he had been afraid for years of letting anyone else see how much that loss had cost him, and that fear had quietly shaped every decision he made since. When she finally approached, she handed him a new contract, not one meant to own his time or his loyalty, but an invitation to help build something worth building. Mason signed it, this time entirely by his own choice, with no threat hanging over his shoulder and nothing left buried beneath silence. The scorched drone that had once been dismissed as worthless scrap now sat displayed in the Langford lobby, no longer a relic of destruction, but a quiet reminder that truth could be burned without ever truly dying. A year later, the Grace Initiative unveiled its first completed rescue drone before a small crowd gathered near the same hangar where everything had nearly ended in flames. The aircraft carried none of the menace of a weapon, designed instead to fly directly into dangerous terrain, locate survival signals, deliver medical supplies, and support rescue teams working in places no road could reach quickly enough. Evelyn was no longer the kind of executive who chased headlines for the sake of appearances. She had become someone willing to confront the darkest corners of her own company rather than hide from them. Mason was no longer a man bowed under the weight of his own past either. He remained quiet, modest in the same way he had always been, but he no longer flinched at the mention of Logan's name or the program that had once cost him everything he valued. During the public flight demonstration, a reporter asked him directly why he had chosen to return to a field of technology that had once nearly destroyed his life. Mason answered simply that technology itself carried no conscience, but the people who built it carried the responsibility of giving it boundaries. Evelyn watched the new aircraft climb steadily into the open sky, remembering the day she had bought a pile of burned scrap purely out of ambition, with no understanding of what it truly contained. She understood now that without Mason recognizing a single carved name inside the wreckage, she might have unknowingly resurrected something far closer to a weapon of betrayal than a meaningful legacy worth preserving. She thought often, in the months that followed, about how close everything had come to slipping past her entirely, how easily she might have walked past Mason on that auction floor the way everyone else had, dismissing him as nothing more than a man with grease on his hands. Instead, that brief exchange had unraveled a conspiracy that had quietly shaped her family's company for years without her ever knowing it existed. She no longer measured success by headlines or contract values alone, but by whether the people building her company's future could be trusted with the responsibility that came with it. The closing image lingered on a small plump mounted beneath the original drone displayed in the Langford lobby. It carried no mention of contract value or technical achievement. It read simply that the tribute was for Logan Pierce, and for everyone who chose truth even when silence would have been the safer path. Mason paused beside that plaque for a few quiet seconds before walking onward toward the new hangar, carrying with him a sense of closure, justice, and a future finally rebuilt on something honest. If you want to know why that single carved name could destroy an entire corporation, stay until the very end.